In the previous lesson, what we did was introduce the concept of moral absolutism as an ethical theory, or at least a broad class of ethical theories that asserts that ethics and morality and moral principles are objective in nature. They are absolute. They are based on some universal truth. We then also talked about where there's a lot of disagreement for moral absolutists, and this is within the realm of what actually we can do to ground these moral beliefs. How is it we're able to ground our moral beliefs? We talked about the idea of Platonic idealism and how Plato was able to ground ethical principles and ethical beliefs, and we talked about how maybe somebody who was religious could do something like that. In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the ethics of human rights as another method of being able to ground moral beliefs. We say that there are some universal moral truths because there are these universal human rights that exist in the world, and we can ground them using this. So that's what the ethics of human rights essentially entails. So effectively, what we're doing is talking about grounding ethical principles through the language and the study of human rights, and rather than looking at it through the language of religion, like in the previous lesson, or looking at how, for example, Plato was able to do something like this, we're talking about how we can do so using human rights theories. One of the main challenges for a moral absolutist is, how can we ground moral absolutes? We talked about this in the last lesson. How are we able to effectively be able to ground these principles and be able to explain why there are universal truths? On what basis do universal moral truths exist? Do they exist on the basis of religion because an omnipotent, omniscient God says so? Or, like in this lesson, can we ground these beliefs using the language of human rights? We know that to say genocide is universally wrong, but we don't know why this is the case, and we need to explain why this is the case for us to have a better understanding of this kind of morality. And according to human rights, and according to a human rights framework, there exists a number of fundamental rights and freedoms, and that these rights are universal. So we would say, answering the first question, how do we ground moral absolutes? Why are there universal moral truths? The answer to that question is, well, because there are fundamental universal human rights that everybody has, these inalienable rights as described by the Founding Fathers, for example. Now, according to human rights philosophy and to human rights law, human beings are endowed with certain inalienable rights, which is the language that we would see in the Declaration of Independence. And the question for this is, why? So we've explained why there are moral absolutes, why moral absolutism is true according to this framework. But then we've got to explain, well, if there are these inalienable rights, if there are these universal human rights, why do they exist? Why do we have these kinds of human rights? Well, one explanation is, by virtue of being a human, you have certain rights that exist. And that is one way in which we can explain it. These are things that are attached to the ontological concept of personhood, the ontological concept of being a human. So we think, what is a person? What is a human? And you can explain this by virtue of, well, being a human is having some of these rights. That's one way in which we can explain it. But then the next question is, well, what rights? What rights are there that exist? Well, we could say there are lots of, there's a lot more moral disagreement related to actually what human rights exist. If we take a look at some of the fundamental, foundational frameworks of human rights law, we could talk about, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights as codified by the Human Rights Act in the United Kingdom. We could talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights, which is something that was established after the end of the Second World War. We could even talk about the existence of certain rights within certain contexts. So, for example, where there is rights for individuals that are engaged in armed conflict, that means we'd look at things like the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, and talk about the rights that are of protected individuals within the virtues of within the situation, of armed conflict. But what rights are there that are these rights that exist by virtue of being human? Do they all exist by virtue of being human, or are they certain fundamental rights, and that there are also legal protections for other rights that may exist? Well, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, as I've just mentioned, is one of the most widely accepted legal documents on the protection of human rights. It contains 30 articles, most of which are endowing certain rights and responsibilities for states to protect the rights. So of the 30 articles that exist in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, some of them are actually explaining what the rights are, and then other ones are talking about the duties and responsibilities of states to protect said rights. Or we could talk about, as I mentioned, the European Convention on Human Rights. This document is directly able to be utilised in European law. So one thing that is interesting within the European Convention on Human Rights is there's a body of jurisprudence that has developed as a result of it, because it has its own court and it has its own adjudication, and states that are a party to the European Convention on Human Rights and that are members of the Council of Europe have a legal obligation and a moral obligation to uphold these convention rights. They both contain a cross-pollination of rights. So there are certain rights that exist in one that also exist in the other. So for example, Article 3 of the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides for the, quote, right to life, which is something that is quite fundamental in terms of human rights. By virtue of being a human, you have a right to be alive. You have a right for somebody not to take your life in any measurable way. This is also a right that is found in Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Equally, there is a prohibition of torture, prohibition of slavery, of forced labour. There's a right to liberty and security, and there's a right to a fair trial and due process of law, for example. So these are all additional rights that exist. And according to the human rights theorist Cristobal Orrego, human rights are defined as, quote, that what is due to another because he has title to that object. My life, for example, could be called a right in this sense, as it belongs to me. So Orrego makes a quite personal way in which we engage with human rights, talking about how human rights are individual rights that exist and belong to certain individuals. It places human rights into the hands of the individual person. They are rights in the sense that they belong to an individual. So the right to life, as codified in Article 3 of the UDHR or Article 2 of the ECHR, are the right to life, the right to your individual personal life. By virtue of being a human being, you have human rights. So this is one way in which we can ground moral absolutes, and it's a good way of grounding moral absolutes in a secular world. If you're somebody who wants to believe in and accept moral absolutism as a framework for ethical inquiry, and you're not religious, you might find it difficult to find a way of being able to ground moral absolutes. Well, human rights language and the language of human rights is one way in which you can do that. We can also delineate between the different types of rights that exist. This framework establishes that there are two classifications of human rights. These are primary rights and secondary rights. On the one hand, primary rights will exist independent of the nation state. Before governments and before states existed in the way that we understand them to exist today, human beings had these universal primary rights. So this places a distinction between what we would describe as human rights that exist in virtue of somebody who lives in a state, who lives in the nation state, the modern nation state as they exist today, and human rights that predate that, human rights that are that exist in virtue of the existence of human beings. So secondary rights are rights that presuppose the existence of the state. It means that they can only exist and will only exist because the state exists. And this is one way in which we can classify rights. Another way in which we can classify rights is to delineate them into different families of rights. And human rights can be classified into certain groups. So let's look at this, the most common classification. Most commonly, people have what are known as security rights, rights to security, and this exists in certain different ways. We have legal rights, so things like right to a fair trial and right to due process of law as rights that are prescribed in law. You may have political rights, rights related to things like freedom of assembly and freedom of protest, expression. You might have welfare rights, so rights that involve the ability for the state to impose a certain level of welfare that individuals must live under. And there are also equality rights, the right to equality, the rights to against a prohibition, for example, of discrimination, etc., etc. So this is one way in which we could describe moral absolutism and ground our moral claims from this framework. This is not the only way we can do so. Like I've said, we can talk about religious ways in which we can do it, and there are also other ways of looking at this as well. Now, this is not a in-depth analysis of the philosophy of human rights. I'm sure we will do lessons on that in the future. This is just one way in which we can touch on human rights as a way of measuring moral absolutism. In the next lesson, we're going to introduce the alternative theory to moral absolutism, which is the concept of moral relativism.